All right, I think we're ready to go for tonight's presentation. It's going to be a great one with Rob. There's been a lot of connections evidently among Rob and people that are on the screen right now. Just a couple of quick announcements. We had a monthly board meeting this morning, and it went well. A couple things. If you haven't been on our website lately, you may want to check it out. We did a revamp on it. I think it's a lot better. The feedback I've been getting is it's a lot more easier to use than the other one. It just went up just a couple days ago, and I want to thank Mike Lent and Kelly Beth Dillinger and Becky Moses for putting all that together. And I really would encourage everyone to check it out. Another thing that you should know also is the ballots for the next election have been sent out. You should have received them by now. They went out with the November snapshot issues. Just a reminder, they had to be received back here in Waltham by November 29th. And you should also know that if you haven't paid your dues, sorry, but we can't count your ballot. So I would strongly encourage you to make sure your dues are all paid up. Finally, I want to just put in a reminder too. You should have got a notice that in the 2023 journal that's under preparation, it's going to be a commemorative type thing about 50 years of PHSNE. This is our 50th anniversary. And one of the features that we have in there, what we're going to have in there, it's an opportunity to hear from you folks. And you should have got a notice, either an email or somewhere else, constant contact, about what we call looking back and traveling forward. And what we're asking is for folks to send us the stories, just a couple paragraphs at the most, maybe how you joined PHSNE, a PHSNE moment, something like that. That would be interesting. And we will print those. We may have to be selective on how many we can print, but if they're not in print in the hard copy, they are all going to be on electronic copy. But right now, I think we may be able to fit in most, if not all of them. So I would strongly encourage you to send us your story. PHSNE is about people. It always has been and always will be. And in those small stories, tidbits of information, I think go a long way in more or less defining the fabric that PHSNE is. And you can just send that small comment or story, not only about the past, but also any recommendations you may have that we should do or not do in the future. And if you can just send that to a journal at phsne.org, we will get it and we will look it over, and you could get your name in the 50th commemorative journal, which I can guarantee is going to be a collector's item all over the world, many, many years to come, I hope. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dana, I guess. And Dana, you want to kick off the program?
Thanks, John. I'm really excited about the journal. And I am Dana G. I'm the program coordinator for PHSNE, and welcome to our November presentation. And before I introduce our speaker, Rob Niederman, a few announcements. You probably saw the active screen is being recorded for YouTube. And for this presentation, if you go up to the top right where it says view, I would choose speaker view for this presentation so that you could see the full screen presentation and you'll see folks on the side. And then when we end the evening, we can go back to gallery view. And please stay muted during the presentation. Your video and audio buttons are at the bottom left of your screen. Please keep the red line through your microphone icon so that we're going to have people type their questions into the chat, which is also at the bottom of the screen. And once the program, Rob's section is finished, I'll relay the questions to Rob. And if we have time at the end, we'll do some live questions. I'm sure there will be quite a few because this is really exciting. I'm really happy that Rob could join us. So Rob Niederman is a collector and historian specializing in pre-1900 American wood and brass cameras and accessories. His articles appear in publications by the Photographic Historical Society of New England, the Photographic Collectors Club of Great Britain, the American Photographic Historical Society, the Michigan Photographic Historical Society, the Cascade Photographic Historical Society, and the Chesapeake Antiquarian Photographic Society. Rob's knowledge of photography contributes to his understanding of early equipment. He built a darkroom at the age of 11 and began shooting large format up to 11 by 14 inches by age 17, and continues to study pictures by master photographers. In 1980, he was accepted into Ansel Adams' Yosemite workshop. In 2011, working with another collector, Rob completed a 1.5-year endeavor called the Digitized Kodak Catalogue Project. He is consulted by curators, educators, and researchers seeking information on early cameras and equipment. And he can drop his email into the chat so that you guys can reach out. And with that, I will turn it over to Rob.
I am unmuted. Thanks for the kind introduction. I appreciate it. And I'm really excited to present to the PHSNE group. And I was just kind of going through all the people, and there's a lot of friends here that I know. But I have a rather lengthy presentation, and I'm just going to kind of dive into it. Let me share the screen quite briefly, and we'll get going. There it is. Share. And hopefully everybody can see the title slide here. I worked out in some animations and I discovered Zoom doesn't do them very well. But one of the things I do is when I collect cameras, and a lot of the people who know me, I really get hard-nosed about the research, learning about the apparatus, why it was built, who it was built for, and so forth. And I liken this, the maturation of photography since Daguerre all the way to the digital age, as a big evolutionary tree. And as the photography grew, it branched out, and a lot of interesting designs came about this. And normally when we look at the design of cameras, we usually talk about their successes and some of their interesting byproducts. So I subtitled this presentation, "What Were Some Makers Thinking About?" And as I get deeper in the presentation, I think you'll appreciate that secondary title. Whoops, went too far. So anyway, what I enjoy doing is not only looking at the successes of camera design that bred success, that kept the tree growing, I look at all the things that didn't work as well, because they didn't go as planned, or they created dead-end branches. But by looking at things that didn't go well, we learn a lot about what will work in the future. And that's what this presentation is about. Here's kind of the order of the presentation. It's chronological. It starts in the Daguerrean era and then moves into the turn of the century, about 1910 or so. And then I end the presentation with two very odd devices. So let me get started in the meat of this thing. I'm going to share a slide here. Everybody knows it. Everybody's an experienced collector. We talk about the hard image dilemma. It's laterally reversed. There's really nothing new here. We see this in daguerreotypes, tintypes, and ambrotypes. And since the beginning, people have been talking about how to get around it. And one of the simpler answers is rephotograph the image. But the quality gets a little degraded. So what I did learn in a lot of research on this is the fact that Daguerre knew about this at the time he wrote his treatise in 1839 about the daguerreotype process. Here I'm showing a page from the 1840 English translation. And in there, if I just do that, I put a little square around it where Daguerre writes that there is the instrument, meaning the camera, has the disadvantage of flipping the image. But he also knew there was a solution to it. The fact that he could attach an image to the front of, a mirror to the front of a camera, and it would reverse the image around. Now you had to turn the camera to the side of whatever you were photographing it by 90 degrees, but it worked. However, he did lament the fact that it slowed down the picture taking process. By the 1840s, there was enough interest in correcting devices whereby they started showing up in catalogs. And on the right, I show two examples of that. Now, I want to just take an aside here that there's a lot of stuff in the presentation, and I am making a PDF version of the presentation available so you can review it a little later on and remember these things. But here in the 1840s, we do see things sold like mirrors, prisms, and more mirrors. Now, about a year and a half ago, and I'm going to give a shout out to Ralph London because I know he's on here because I saw him. Ralph offered me a Daguerrean prism, a correcting device. I've been looking for one of these for the better part of 20 years, and they, for some reason, are hideously rare and you can never find them. The George Eastman Museum has at least 3 or 4 mirrors. Matt Eisenberg had at least a prism and a mirror, but this became available to me. You can see it's brass mounted in it's optical glass prism mounted in a very heavy brass enclosure and with a flap shutter, which becomes important because when you slip this onto the front of a lens, you lose the capability of doing a lens cap exposure. Now, after I got it, of course, I had to check it to see if it fit on my camera. And ironically, I was completely shocked about this. It did. It fit on the lens of my American chamfered camera that you can see here. So of course, I had to do a little fooling around with it. I wanted to see how it works. I have a photography table that I do a lot of pictures of cameras on. So I set up a simple scene of a Daguerreotype book and a stereo viewer. And it was easy. I pointed the camera straight at the subject matter and took a picture of the ground glass. And you can see the result in the upper right-hand picture. And if anybody has shot large format photography, you know that the image is upside down and backwards. It's pretty familiar. However, when I put the the prism on the camera, I have to turn it to the right angle of the subject. And this is where I got really confused. I've been shooting large format photography for the better part of 4 decades. And there's a lot of muscle memory involved in that. And I got to admit, everything was counterintuitive to everything I tried. And this becomes important in the next slide in a little bit. But eventually I got it right and took a picture of the ground glass. And as you can see, the image flipped. So there is enough here that some photographers decided to try it out. The best example is a daguerreotypist by the name of John Plumb. And in 1846, he traveled to Washington, D.C., shot 8 daguerreotypes of major federal buildings. And what's interesting about them all is that all the images are laterally correct. That means any building with a signage on it, you could read it correctly. Now, all of these images were discovered in California at a flea market of all places in 1972. Great story behind it. I wish I had the time to talk about it. But in any case, of all the images that were available by Plumb, I chose this one for a couple reasons. Not only is it a good example of an image that a daguerreotype that is laterally correct, the camera is squared dead center to the building. That means that there are no converging lines. And if anybody knows that takes pictures of buildings, when you look up to them, the height converges. If you look at them in perspective at maybe a 45-degree angle, they diminish from the side. This building is absolutely perfectly composed. That meant that John had to be on an elevated platform or some type of hill or something to square up the camera to the door. I did some measurements, and I believe the center of the building is about 3 to 5 feet above the door. But imagine for a moment, he's out there on a platform or a hill, the camera's on a stand, and it's turned 90 degrees to the building. That's quite an achievement, especially when it's outdoors, but it worked. Now, given the success of these pictures that Plumb made, I would have assumed that photographers embraced these correcting devices, but they didn't. And there's a lot of opinion about why this didn't happen. Probably the most prevailing opinion is that when people looked at their portraits as in a daguerreotype, they really saw themselves as if they were looking at a mirror. So it really didn't bother them. The other thing is, if there was a daguerreotype of a landscape, Well, there are no visual cues to tell you that the landscape is reversed. However, the grand number of daguerreotypes we see are reversed. The lettering is reversed, the books are reversed. So it kind of indicates that these were not widely embraced. So I can't explain it, but that's kind of the way it is. Now, for a while, as wet collodion came in, the correcting devices just fell out of everybody's mind. They were forgotten until around 1872, when Edward Estabrook was writing a book called The Daguerreotype and How to Make It. And in the book, he wanted to include a non-reversed ferrotype as at the beginning of the book. And so he went about looking for correcting prisms. There's a passage here I write about, and I'm not going to read it through, but he basically said he recalls there was something going on in the Daguerrean period, but he looked around and he couldn't find any. And he concluded that maybe these weren't practical. But he did go out and ordered a prism from France, and it was brought into the US where he used it. And in the process of publishing the book, he shot thousands of pictures, and he says he made about 150 a day. I want to bookmark that thought for the next slide because that becomes very interesting. In a later edition in his books, he shows a photographer, this really great etching of a photographer working with a wing multiplying camera. And if you look carefully, and if my cursor works, you can see right here, a prism is attached to the lens. And you can see that the camera is turned to the side. Now, moving on and keeping with the theme of the Daguerrean period, I'm going to switch the conversation slightly to what I call image commoditization. So we've kind of left the discussion of correcting devices. We've seen a solution that didn't live very long, but in the early part of image making, I would say it's artisan-based. It's slow, deliberate, and more artful in mind. There wasn't a lot of commerce about it. But then again, Beaumont Newhall, in his landmark book, History of Photography, said there were a lot of price wars going on, and images got less expensive as time went on. And even I did find a reference that John Plumb did sell small daguerreotypes for 50 or 25 cents. And so we're still in that custom region of photography where images were not accessible to anybody of modest means. However, in 1854, that all changed. In 1854, André Adolphe Eugène Desdery invented the carte de visite and patented the process. In that same gesture, he created a 4-lens multiplying camera capable of making multiple images on a single plate. And this, in my mind, changed everything, because now the cost of a plate is diluted by the number of images you can put on it. And now we move into the commercialization of photography, whereby we get into a high volume, low cost model. And again, when I remember I said that Estabrook said he was making 150 images in a day, Beaumont Newhall did the research and said some of these dedicated image producing companies could do 1,000 a day. Now we're getting into the mass production of images, the lowering of costs, and bringing it to the masses where everybody can enjoy a picture. Now, Edward Estabrook also said that in 1871, he had seen people advertising tintypes unmounted for as little as 10 cents a dozen. That is remarkable. I attribute everything here to the creation of the multiplying camera. So in concept, it's basically a camera with multiple lenses. It could actually have 1 lens, 4 lenses, 9 lenses, or 16 lenses. Really didn't matter. The concept being that when you took the pictures, things could happen and multiple images show up on a plate, glass plate, or a tintype. This is a typical camera from the 1860s to the 1880s, American camera. And you can see it has 4 lenses, and I also have a 9-tube lens set where I can swap it out and take 9, you can make 9 images on a plate. The camera also has a wide back, which enables a photographer to actually make more images on the plate than there are lenses. Now, the famous daguerreotypist Simon Wing, daguerreotypist, gallery owner, businessman, and politician, he's probably best known to equipment people like me for making amazingly sophisticated multiplying cameras. They were so good, in fact, that he once said he could take one of his 4-lens cameras, put a 12 by 15 plate in it, and the image area of a 12 by 15 plate is really 11 by 14. But he could make 616 1/2 by 1/2 images, gem size images, on the single plate in a span of about 5 minutes. That is amazing. So now we're looking at the mass production of images and bringing them to anybody who would like to buy them. Now, in the lower right corner here, I show an example of a registration system on a John stock. And on the plate holder, you can see some little markings. It helps the photographer keep track of where they're photographing on the plate. So let's just break this down in real simple matters. I have a 9-lens camera. Whoops, no automation. There we go. That can produce 9 images on a 5 by 7 plate. And when I look at the cost of a box of plates, the production of an individual image is just roughly over 1/2 cent. But if we factor in the type of thinking that Simon Wing was doing, 20, 50, 100, hundreds of images on a plate, the price gets down to 300 to 400 of a penny. Now that's a lot of margin. Now I want to keep in mind here that that's not a fully burdened cost. It doesn't include all the other things that make a studio operate, chemistry, mounts, and so on, labor. However, it gives you an idea of the margins that photographers can start dealing with. And some photographers have gone on record of saying that they had made profits anywhere from $70 to $85 a month. And carte de visites were pretty much conceptually the same, but a slightly different production model. There were people who took it to the extreme real quickly. It's a fabulous 1870s 36 lens wet plate John Roberts. The beauty of this camera is it had a fixed back, but 36 lenses. Just with the manipulation of a couple flap shutters, in a minute you can get 36 pictures taken immediately. This camera was owned by Wayne Cogan in the early 2000s, and Wayne once told me he was selling the camera. I tried desperately to buy it. He sold it to Matt Eisenberg, so it went with Matt Eisenberg's collection. Several years later, I came across this classified ad that you see in the lower left that talked about one of these cameras. So I emailed it to Wayne and Matt and I said, hey, look at this. Matt turned around and emailed me the picture you see on the right here. He was either finished a presentation or was working on it. And there we have a photographer standing proudly next to his equipment. And there is a 36 lens camera. And to me, this is one of the great joys of collecting equipment, getting a piece of an apparatus, a camera, finding period documentation about it, and then seeing a photographer who actually used this type of thing. Anyhow, these cameras continue to evolve. And there we go. As we move out of the wet plate era into the dry plate era, gelatin dry plates, the cameras could be made a little thinner because the chemistry wasn't caustic. And because you could use less wood, makers got pretty imaginative in their designs. Now, these are kind of the extreme end of the designs. However, an interesting thing happened on the way to getting to the 1900s. Photographers felt that buying a lot of lenses weren't cost effective. Since we now had cameras with really great backs on them, they chose to buy multiplying cameras with a single lens and shifting backs. These are called penny picture cameras. Now, penny picture is not a camera design, it's actually a marketing term, meaning that you could buy a camera with all the equipment surrounding it to make pictures for pennies. So those eventually gave way in the mid-1900s for a very interesting reason. In 1888, George Eastman created the landmark Kodak camera. Everybody knows about it. roll film, 100 pictures, circular pictures in the camera, and that brought in an entirely new audience into the photographic mainstream. So snapshots and pictures of daily life, vernacular images became the norm. So these, and plus the addition of, since you had a negative material, you could make unlimited numbers of pictures from a single negative, be it film or glass plates. The whole notion of multiplying picture cameras served their purpose and eventually died out. These cameras are kind of the end of the line, so to speak, and these are in my collection. They're very odd, but they all have something in common. They're single lens cameras. The top two cameras are fixed lenses with shifting backs. As you can see, they're moving around a little bit, and here the Sunflower has a carrier that moves side to side, and the big wing moves up and down. The two bottom cameras are exactly the opposite, fixed backs and shifting lenses. And in the case of the Montauk, I make a comment, could this be the last of the multiplying cameras? It's a rare camera, about 3 are known. But I ask the question because as I look at my ephemera, catalogs, manufacturers' brochures, and so on, the lexicon of multiplying cameras and penny picture cameras dies out around 1910. And then after that, I'm hard pressed to find anybody selling multiplying cameras. So that's why I asked the question. Now, 2 years later, Harvey Wing, the son of Simon Wing, took his father's patent for these sliding panels and shrunk it down into a 4x5 box camera that could make 9 images on a glass plate. There are 3 of these prototypes known, and I've owned this camera for a while, and I've always wondered why Harvey Wing did this. Well, the answer came about in PHSNE's journal of last year. There's an issue dedicated to Simon Wing, and the answer came about in that issue, and it's new knowledge to me, and I'm excited about it. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but I suggest reading it because it talks about how Harvey Wing asked one of his cabinet makers to make the camera, and then he went and marketed this camera to George Eastman, Manhattan, Gunlock, and Seneca. Great story. Highly recommend reading it. But at the end of the day, we can say goodbye to the concept of multiplying cameras. I want to move on to a period in the evolutionary tree that I really enjoy personally. Not that I don't enjoy early cameras, but there was a time in this 10-year period in the 1890s, actually 5 years before, maybe 10 years after, where plate cameras were colliding in a big way with roll film photography. So when people came out of the 1880s and into the early 1890s, if you were to buy a camera, it was pretty much a view camera thinking. Now, there were other permutations of all this, but it simplifies the discussion if I break it into view cameras and roll film cameras. Now, view cameras are slow and deliberate. You work on a tripod, and you do all your work on the ground glass. You stick your head under a dark cloth and you manipulate plate holders and take a picture. Slow and deliberate. Roll film cameras, on the other hand, are just the opposite. They're easy to use. It doesn't matter if it's a bellows camera or a box camera. People would want to load their camera with film, take a picture, wind a key, take another picture, and let someone else mess with all the messiness of printing and enlarging and all that. So these are the two fundamental thoughts, but it's also the first time the notion of cameras that could do each other's work came into play. Now, some view cameras, the backs could be removed and an Eastman Walker roll holder could be attached to it. Although it continued to work like a view camera, you could now shoot roll film. And the opposite was true with roll film. Many of the cameras could have backs that came off, and the manufacturers made plate backs for them. So a roll film camera could actually shoot plates. But so these are the two dominating thoughts. And as I said earlier, there are other ways to look at it, but this becomes interesting as we move on. Whoops, since I don't have the automation. So along comes George Eastman in about 1890. he creates what I consider is a legendary camera series called the Folding Kodak cameras. Now, before I talk about him a little bit, I want to focus in on this comment he made up here during a lawsuit with Thomas Blair. And in there, he really says, glass dry plates are going bye-bye, they're gone, and the future of photography is film. And it's very prophetic because, of course, he was also very deep into film and roll film. So he created this camera, and what makes it an intriguing design, it is a great self-pacing camera, meaning you can push the bellows in front into the camera body and then flip up the bed, and you've got a camera completely enclosed in a leather box. Now, these cameras are also purposely designed for both roll film and plates. Now, I'm going to do a sidebar on these cameras saying I can look at the essence of these designs and trace the DNA of this body pattern all the way into cameras being made into the 1950s and 1960s. Now, that's not to say that this body pattern was there, but the essence of what this body pattern represents is carried over into the mid to late 1900s. That's longevity, and that's really important. Now you can see it's a fairly big camera, and I have a picture of it down here with an Eastman roll plate holder. And it's a big camera. You can see there's a picture of a woman holding a number 5 version of this on her. And this number 6 is whole plate. So it's 6.5 by 8.5 inches. And it's fully loaded with glass plates. It's just shy of 12 pounds, according to the advertising. That's a big camera. That also means there's a lot of room for improvement. The success of this design in the 1890s was important because other companies copied it. Not this exact pattern, but they slimmed it down. American Optical, Rochester Optical, Seneca, Manhattan Optical. There's just a whole litany of companies that copied this, and they were very successful. But given the nature of this presentation, I want to show you some of the side thinking that wasn't successful, but is intriguing. So let's take a look at some of these. Here we have 3 cameras. They were made by people who made plate cameras. They're bellows designs, but they're modified cameras. They don't have the ground glass anymore. And what these people wanted to do was take the clumsiness of plates and kind of automate it a little bit. Not roll film convenient, but they did it in such a way where they took the plates, put them in sheaths, and then put them in a magazine back. And you can see the various backs here. And by moving the back in and out of the body, there were simple mechanics in there that could change the plate. It wasn't easy, but it worked. But if you look at these, the dates on them, they're very, very short-lived. Now, I still own these cameras. When I first bought them, I played with them, and I can attest that they do jam, which is not a good thing when you're out in the field taking pictures. And you've never seen a collector more nervous taking these things apart and unjamming them. I'm happy to say no cameras were harmed in the experiment. So moving to the next year, Thomas Blair came about and did just the opposite. He took some of his folding Hawkeye roll film cameras and he modified it. And here what he wanted to do was take a roll film camera and bring in some of the goodness of view cameras. So he encased the roll film in some kind of back that comes out of the camera at the top, and it has a dark slide to keep the film from being exposed. And by lifting the back up, you can get access to a ground glass and now do more precision work, the focusing and composition precision of a view camera. And then to take the picture, you push it down, pull a dark slide out, and take the picture. You could also use it as a basic roll film camera. These things are really kind of clumsy. It worked. It's also short-lived. And Manhattan Optical also made its version of this camera called the Wizard Duplex. And it too lasted only 2 years, 2 to 3 years. And I played with this camera. I always felt I was going to break it. And all I can say is when anybody was out there, have a tripod and a little bit of patience. And it doesn't surprise me it didn't last very long. So after that, and I get kind of humored about this because Thomas Blair came at it again. After he discontinued the other camera, he came up with the combination Hawkeye. Now, ironically, the George Eastman team came up with the screen focus Kodak. And these cameras look very much alike, even they're from two different factories, two different companies, yet they operate the same way. They both can shoot plates and roll film, but it needs a little manipulation to do it. To shoot a plate, you would unhook the back, swing it up, and then you would take the plate assembly that came with the camera, attach it to the camera. Then you could shoot plates. If you wanted to shoot roll film, you had to unassemble everything and then put the roll film holder back down, and now you could shoot roll film pictures. The advantage is you could shoot plates mid-roll with roll film. Good idea. And the combination Hawkeye didn't last very long. There were about 4,000 of these screen focus cameras made. And the reason I put this arrow here is that the concept of a camera having a plate back continued on as late as 1934 in the number 3A series of cameras. Not this camera, but something was learned about this. And for some reason, George Eastman kept this combination concept alive for decades. So there was something interesting that came out of this. But when we look at all this crossbreeding between roll film cameras and view cameras, the only thing I can say is by adding those features, you sacrifice simplicity. And that includes the final camera in this portion of the presentation. I present to you the multi-scope Alvista number 5, a company that was based in Burlington, Wisconsin, best known for making box panoramic cameras. The lens swung side to side, pretty much like the Eastman Panorama series. They were best known for it. They came about in about 1897. And in 1901, they got this idea that they would make what I call the Swiss Army knife of all cameras. And as you can see in the ad, 7 cameras in one. And what I want to do is read the top portion of this. I'm kind of going to lean in here a little bit. It says, for the tourist, and especially the foreign traveler, etc., this outfit meets the universal demand as both plates and film and all that other marketing stuff. Well, I think about tourists and I think about travelers. I don't know if big cameras were really appealing to them because this is a big camera. Although it can shoot 4x5 cut film and plates and panoramics and this and that, the camera is roughly 11.5 inches wide, 7.5 inches deep, and roughly 6.5 inches high. That's a lot of camera. And you can see is if you wanted to carry the outfit around, you had 2 fronts. You had the panoramic front and the special front they made for this camera that looked like a plate camera. And all of this stuff would go into this big case. That's a lot to carry around. Anyway, I am shocked that this thing lasted as long as it did. And there are only 3 good examples of this camera around. It's a very rare camera. I've seen others for sale. They are just torn to shreds, missing parts, and so on. I was at another collector's collection about a month and a half ago. I saw the 5x7 version of this camera, and that makes this one look small. So interesting concepts, and we can say goodbye to all these hybrid cameras, except for that one Kodak. I want to come out of the discussion of camera body design and talk about an interesting thing that happened for about a decade or two. And what it was is the rise of cameras with 2 shutters. Let me add that in there. There we go. So there was a perfect combination of things that happened in the evolution of photography. Gelatin chemistry got really good. It was very sensitive to light. Lenses optically got great, so they could pass a lot of light. And then as the amateurs came into the market, there was more of a demand for action pictures, not pictures of people leisurely sitting or maybe walking, but fast-moving things as described in this 1893 blurb from the Journal of American Photography. And what it is here, when you have 2, so ask the question of why do I have 2 lenses? Well, in order to do everything everybody wants, Mechanical shutters had a natural stopping point about 150th of a second. They had slow shutter speeds, but they really couldn't capture rapid movement. Now, Thornton Pickard, who made roller blind shutters since 1886, those shutters went to about 1,000th of a second. And so to make this work on a larger format, not roll film formats, what they did is they enlarged their roller blind shutters and they attached it to the rear of the camera by the plate or the cut film. This created a focal plane shutter. And now you had a shutter that ran to 1,000th of a second. So anybody who wanted to do all these different pictures, they had a choice of which shutter they wanted to use, which would cause a little thinking. This all went away in about 1910 because of two reasons. Number one, mechanical shutters just got better for these larger format cameras. Coilos, for example, started making shutters, mechanical shutters that went to 1,000th of a second. And then conversely, roller blind and focal plane shutters started picking up slow shutter speeds. So if you've got all that, you don't really need two shutters. The second thing is some makers just felt it made sense to make cameras with one shutter. A great example of that is Graflex in the United States, where pretty much just about all their cameras are focal plane shutters. So I find this interesting because how often do you see a camera with two shutters? I do have some catalogs for some companies that sold cameras, actually sold more cameras like this Primo, where you bought the camera and you got the Thornton Pickard shutter with it. I threw this in because I just have so much fun with it. Everybody is familiar with stereo cameras, the fact that you can do lens cap exposures, maybe flap shutters, and in most popular were single lens shutters that were interlinked together. Sometimes they were interlinked or put into a common case and mounted on the camera. This is something else entirely. It is a well-made wooden brass shutter where the blade, the shutter blade, spins like a fan. Doesn't keep spinning, but it's about 180 degrees. The first time I saw it was 20 years ago, and I just fell in love with it. I finally was able to acquire it, and it is a joy to play with. But the first time I used it, I remember getting my fingers all caught up in it. Just an interesting design. It's kind of fun. This is the only one we've ever seen, and I just wanted to share it with everybody. I want to end the presentation with two very interesting accessories. There we go. I'm used to the animation. So anyway, as everybody can see here, you already can recognize the novelty of what I'm about to talk about. This gets into the topic of flash photography, which really started in the early 1850s. There were various means of using it. It eventually came down to magnesium, which is a very interesting material, has a low ignition point, but high burning temperature, 4,000 degrees, tons of sparks, lots of heat and lots of gas, toxic gas. But the fact is it gives you that beautiful bright light that everybody's familiar with, especially if you look at fireworks. So that's one thing. And then it was dangerous. Things caught on fire. During the research of a paper in the early days, flash photography was dangerous. Who would have thought? I came across an article about a photographer made a commentary piece that said, well, when I start shooting pictures with these things, I dampen everything down to reduce the risk of fire. Okay, so what it really says is there were a lot of benefits to the drawbacks and people kept using them. But why would a company make something in the shape of a pistol? You can laughingly call it the first flash gun, and that's kind of an inside joke. Anybody who shot cameras in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s will kind of get it, flash gun. Sorry about that. Anyway, it focuses all of the energy of the burning magnesium into this little bowl so it shoots out forward. And the company was in Wisconsin, the Chelsea Manufacturing Company. And the instructions even include warnings about using this. And there's a couple here, but it says, given the nature of this, don't get within 2 feet of something that's going to burn. That's a comfortable feeling. The second thing is, imagine sitting for your picture and someone walks in with one of these. crazy. So this is one of those, what were people thinking? It's not an uncommon device. It's somewhat rare. I have all the outfit here, and there's a real quick side story I'm going to share with you. I was out in New York picking up a Daguerreotype camera I'd purchased. The name of the collector was Jerry Spiegel. Sadly, he's no longer with us. And Jerry came out and said, "Have you ever seen one of these?" I go, "No, are you selling it?" Of course, I bought it. So as I was about to leave to go to the airport, I told Jerry, "Hey, look, let's save yourself the trouble of packing this up and mailing it to me. I'll just throw it in my backpack and carry it home with the Daguerreotype camera." Jerry leans into me and stares at me for a second, and he goes, "Well, what are you going to say when TSA finds this thing?" So that about a week later, I got it in the mail. So that's the one interesting device. And it's, again, what were they thinking about? I'm going to end the presentation with this very odd device. There we go. It's an automatic retoucher from someone by the name of Theodore Brown. He's the patent holder. It was patented in 1904. And there's some confusion here because it says Tyler Cyclofocus and William Tyler. I believe that Tyler was an investor in Theodore Brown's stuff. In any case, Theodore Brown identified an issue that he thought he could fix. And that is, when gallery photographers took pictures, it wasn't uncommon for people to ask for their images to be retouched, skin softened, shadows lightened up, and so forth. And that was pretty laborious and time consuming and expensive. So Brown said, "I can do that with the device attached to the camera, and we'll do it while the exposure is being made." So down here on a box end top, it makes some claims about retouching automatically during the exposure. And it's a really beautifully made device. It's brass and steel and springs, and simply all it is a spinning disc with a lot of little holes in the disc. And each hole would be akin to a lens aperture. Some of the holes are big, some of them are little, but it spins very fast. And when you're taking a picture, the big and little holes spin past the lens, and the theory being that it would modify the way the light came on the plate and change the way the plate was exposed. Okay, so I decided to make myself an honorary Mythbuster, if anybody's familiar with the old TV show. I wanted to see it for myself. And like the Mythbusters, I decided to check it out, think about how to set it up, and then find a way to use the device that represented what the device was meant to do. So it really came down to the subject. Well, I felt that portraits would be a good idea, and I thought, well, no one's going to sit still. And I thought, who doesn't like little grandchildren? But obviously, they aren't going to sit still either. So I do collect some advertising art from Guinness, and what you see here is an original canvas with paint on it. It's concept art. However, the beauty of this is I can shoot a picture of the policeman that I'm showing you here, and at the same time, the canvas is woven, so any paint on the canvas will act like textured skin or rough skin. And if the device was to do its job, it would soften that effect. So I set it up. Here's briefly the setup. Not a lot to talk about. I took my trusty high-resolution camera, took the lens off it, put it at the back of a view camera so I could use a period lens, and you can see it's attached, set everything up, lit it up. And then I shot a couple sets of pictures. I set a baseline exposure, and it worked. And I shot 3 sets of pictures with and without the retoucher, just to make sure I got the same results, which I did. So there you see the setup. And come on, there we go. Here are the results. And normally these would have faded in, but these are the results of the picture. These are images straight from the Nikon. No manipulation, no Photoshop, no Lightroom, none of that. I wanted to show it as it was meant to be. Now, for those who are curious, I did use a manual exposure for all the pictures. The baseline exposure is around ISO 31 at 2.5 seconds. It was a long enough exposure that if the retoucher was to do anything, we would see it. So here are the pictures, and you can notice that without, what that means is the retoucher was on the camera, but the disc was not spinning merrily away. And here is with the picture with the disc spinning away as the retoucher was supposed to work. Now you notice that the picture on the right is a little darker. That makes sense because there were a lot of small holes that passed the lens, so the picture got slightly underexposed. However, any good photographer could overcome that. But that's not where the story is. The story is when I started doing pixel peeping. So I enlarged real deeply to say, did the texture soften as claimed? So here I have a couple details. And as you look carefully, you can see the texture on the canvas through the paint, the ear, the collar, and so on. Let's pretend that's rough skin that was supposed to have been retouched and smooth. Well, on the retouched picture, I still see textured canvas. I see it in the ear, the collar, and the background. So at the end of the day, the product really didn't do anything. So myth busted. I've always wanted to say that. Anyways, the retoucher did not live up to its claims. So to recap the presentation, I talked about some solutions, and they were mainly to address real world problems, and they went away as the market matured. I talked a little bit about the daguerreotype correcting devices. They worked, but for some reason, they just didn't become popular. Multiplying cameras, in my mind, made the industry turn the corner into the commoditization of images. They peaked in the 1870s. They were major factors of this in reducing image prices, but they went away as film and roll film and glass plates took hold. They served their purpose, though. They were very good. Hybrid cameras, the vast majority of them, they didn't even need to exist. I would be surprised if any company made money on those really strange cameras that cross the barriers of view cameras and roll film. Yet the number 3A series of cameras lived on till 1934. So something did come about from that. The two shutter cameras, I talked about them. They had a need. It was a niche market, but they were impractical to use. Flash photography is interesting. As magnesium became safer to use in flash bulbs and stuff, I believe that a lot of photographers breathed a sigh of relief. The fact is their studios didn't catch on fire, and I'm sure some facial hair was saved in the process. But given that flash photography was proper, why did anybody make an igniter in the shape of a pistol? And finally, I talked about the retoucher, and there's an end of the story here. There are two retouchers known. I've heard of a third one. There's one in my collection and one in England. But Brown, who held the patent, was there. I found an article, a 1907 article, where he was taken to court and declared bankrupt. It was because he wasn't paying his investors. He may not have sold enough of these, but he went away. So that's the end of him and his cyclofocus. Anyhow, I look at all these things, and these are just a few oddities in my collection. There's many others I could talk about. However, I'm convinced there are more in other collections. And what I encourage collectors to do is take a look and think about what you're seeing. And I'm sure there's some great stories out there. And if you do find something, I hope you write about it, maybe do a show and tell about it, even a Zoom call about them, because I'm fascinated by these things. And I hope you are too. Anyhow, thank you for your time and the presentation.
Thank you, Rob. That was wonderful. And people could come off mute and give Rob a round of applause.
Thanks.
So great. I see some comments in the chat as well. Rob, would you like to drop your email into the chat in case folks want to reach out so they could just copy and paste that?
Yeah, let me try that here.
Okay, great. It's
Here, whoops, that's not how you spell my email. Now I have to lean in and see what's going on.
And
There it is. Hopefully everybody can see.
perfect. Yes, I can see it. There's a few questions that I jotted down as you were presenting, and 36 lenses. The more lenses there are in the camera, does that increase the risk of overexposing the plate?
Oh, good question. No, it doesn't, because there's a mask behind the lenses that
Oh,
keeps each image separate.
right.
I also forgot to mention the difficulty of making these cameras, and thank you for asking the question. The cameras are not easy to make and use because lenses at the time were hand ground. And so if you wanted to have a multi-lens camera, the lenses had to be optically matched, the first thing. And then second of all, when they're mounted, they all have to be mounted carefully so they all focus at the same plane. Then the photographer had to make sure he lined the camera up square to anything that was going on, because if the camera was askew, half the plate would be out of focus.
Great. Yeah, I can imagine. And I love the picture of the photographer with the 36, like showing off the lenses.
Oh, I love that. I look for those pictures of photographers standing next to their cameras. But I have to thank Matt Eisenberg for that. I'm sorry he's not around. He was a great person to talk to and very sharing. And thank you, Matt. So,
Do you have sources for collecting the ephemera, or um, the picture that you just showed of the photographer with the 36 lens camera? Do you also seek out ephemera in addition to the cameras?
yes, I do. It's a big part of the research. I learn a lot from the ephemera. And as I said earlier, I learn a lot about looking at things that didn't go well, that went bump in the night. So I have a good library of catalogs. I look for images of photographers and their cameras. So all this adds up. And plus, as you had mentioned in the introduction, I did a lot of personal photography. And so I understand cameras deeply. I know how they work. The only thing I haven't done is shot daguerreotypes and wet plates and all that. I just don't want to mess with it all, but I know a lot of photographers who do that. But yeah, the ephemera I've gotten from other collectors. That's my main source. I got a lot of things from Wayne Kogan. Bless his heart, he sold them to me. Sadly, he's not with us either. But then I find some on eBay, but a lot of this stuff is hard to find these days. And it gets quite expensive.
I happen to be a former bookseller, used bookseller, and there are several book fairs annually that I can send you a few dealers' names who specialize if you
Mhm.
don't already know them. So I
Oh,
will,
there's always people to meet, to be
yeah,
honest. So,
let's see. A lot of folks saying that your camera display shelves, this amazing collection that's from Ben.
thanks,
Are
Ben.
those open shelves? How do you keep the dust out?
You don't. Those are open shelves. I lived in another house before we moved into this one where everything was under glass. Strangely, when it was under glass, dust worked its way into the cameras anyway, probably because of the way air conditioners and heating changed the pressure of house. So I'm due to dust everything here. So, but I do have an attitude about collecting, and I mentioned this before the presentation. My collection is rather modest. I don't have many cameras, maybe 80, 85. And the reason is that if any camera is not on display and hidden away, I've got too many cameras. And it also helps me maintain discipline, that I don't go nuts. So if I see a camera I really love, I have to ask the question of, what do I give up in exchange for this other camera? So over the years, I've been able to refine the collection to the point where it is today. And there's like 3 or 4 cameras I'm desperate to buy in the next half a year. And now I'm looking at my space. I've got cameras on tables and wondering, where am I going to put them? So anyway, but thanks for the compliments.
There's one question from Larry Woods, and he said, "Can you briefly go into the long story you skipped over?"
Which one? Is it the one about the Wings prototype camera or?
Larry?
Oh, Larry must be on mute. I see him talking.
Yeah, Larry. I think Larry, you're muted.
And I'm not good at lip
Yeah,
reading.
sorry about that. No, I don't remember. I think it was about Wing, yes.
Okay. I picked up, it's a great story, and thanks for the question. I picked up the information from, as I said earlier, the journal. There was that issue dedicated to Simon Wing. And in there, I'm trying to remember the author. I think it was Cobb Mott, is it, Dana? There was one.
Oh, Randall.
Randall, right. And in there was mention of these prototype cameras. And what the writer did was put some interesting thoughts in what was going on. So really what happened is, the story goes the way I read it in the journal, is that in 1913, Harvey Wing, Simon's son, asked a cabinet maker to make a multiplying camera, a small size. So it took him about a year, and there was a lot of discussion back and forth and letter writing. I don't have it all in front of me, but eventually the camera was presented to Harvey Wing in 1914. And thereby, Harvey, the real question is, why even bother doing this? As I mentioned earlier, because roll film was dominating the market. Well, in the article, I learned that Harvey was maybe thinking about a way to gently wind down the Wing empire, this long established successful story of galleries and cameras and so on. So Harvey approached three companies, I believe from memory, Seneca, Goonlock, and George Eastman Kodak. And the one conversation says that he was hoping they would build the camera on which he could get patent royalties on the sales of the camera. The other discussion is maybe he wanted to sell the patent outright. There is a line of writing in the article in which there's some good correspondence between Harvey and George Eastman, where Harvey says, "I'd like to present this to you. The camera's not done," because George Eastman said, "Gee, can you tell me about the camera and how it works?" And so Harvey said, "Even better, I'll just send you a couple samples." Well, George Eastman looked at it and wrote a letter back that basically said, I can't see this being successful. For one thing, you don't have a ground glass back. And because you don't have a ground glass back, how does a photographer keep track of where they were taking pictures on the plate? Which made a lot of sense, because Harvey's cameras were incomplete. They didn't have all the registration hardware. But eventually he just said, I just don't see this being useful. And he's really thinking in the back of his mind, roll film is it. Because a person would take a picture, move the thing around, and take another picture. That's a lot of work when you could just wind a key with roll film. So eventually, my understanding by reading the article is Goonlock and Seneca, or whoever the third one is, basically just quietly said, no, this isn't for us either. So the whole notion of this camera went away. We know of three prototypes. There's another one in a private collection, and I believe Cobb Mott, or is it Mott Cobb? Randall has one in that family museum as well. And there's a picture of that camera in the article. It's a great story, and it talks about trying to extend something more than it should have been. It's like, gee, do I still need buggy whips in an era of automobiles? So, some people just can't stop. So that's the story, and I hope it means something.
No, thank you. That's great. It's a wonderful issue. I encourage anyone who hasn't seen the 2022 issue on the Wing cameras to, take a look at it. And you can visit the PHSNE.org website for more details on that. Let's see. There's one more question. We're going a little long, but Ben has asked, what cameras are on your wish list, 2 or 3?
Oh, the wish list is difficult. I have an A wish list and a B wish list. The A list is our mythical cameras that are nearly impossible to acquire. Sorry for the long answer, but one of them is the original Blair Tourograph. And I'm not talking about the Tourograph company. I'm talking about Blair's huge box camera where the magazine sat on top of the camera. You had a cloth that went into it. Took me 15 years and I finally got one. I was shocked. But today, there's a couple cameras. I'm looking at a flat folding Kodak that's being offered to me. There are a couple cameras listed on my website. There's a wish list there. And I'm looking at cameras to fill holes in them. There's a lot of interesting cameras, but they're not historically interesting to what I'm trying to achieve in collecting. Flat folding Kodak. There's a couple stereo cameras. Right off the top of my head, I can't remember. But the list is always ongoing.
It's there's so many unicorns. And
Exactly right. Exactly. And it's through friends I get a lot of these. I've been very fortunate over the years by keeping the dialogue open, even before eBay became a thing. I have a lot of close contacts, and Jerry Spiegel, who I mentioned earlier, he was happy to sell me a lot of incredible cameras that I have today. And he did it because he goes, I know you're going to put them on the website and I can always visit them after they're posted. And that meant a lot to me, to be honest.
right. How are we doing for time, Ben?
I think we're doing pretty well. Would it be possible for Rob to post a link to his website into the chat too?
Let me try it out here.
And it is Randall Mottcobb, who is
Randall
the author,
Mottcobb.
who is the author of that article. And while you're doing that, there's one more question from Vladimir Kazan, who says, have you ever heard of the Alexandra Wolcott camera?
Oh, yes. Yeah, very famous camera, 1840s, a mirror-based camera. Yeah, very historically important, very rare. Is there anything in particular, or?
Yeah, there is a replica of that camera in Seiko Museum
Yes.
in Maine.
Yeah, fabulous camera. That's beyond unicorn status, as Dana would say. That's a mythical camera. I've seen pictures of the original, and there's some beautiful copies made of it. Fabulous camera. If everybody's not familiar with it, it's a very unique design. It's like a reflecting telescope, not refracting. Lenses, the light comes in, it hits a parabolic mirror on the back, and then the light is bounced to a mirror at the front of the camera, and it's reflected back to the film plane or the plate plane, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think
It's
there's
a lensless camera.
Yeah, it's incredible. Thanks for bringing that up. Fabulous camera.
Is there anyone who has one more question who wants to ask live? Well, I can't think. Oh,
I'm available in email. If anybody, now Dana, are you going to post the PDF so people
yeah,
can see?
we'll speak to Reich about, making that available on the website, because I know that would be a great resource for folks. And we can also post a link to that on the PHSNE website when we post the Zoom, the archived recording on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, yeah. And you have my email address. Feel free to reach out to me. As you can say, I love this stuff. So,
Thank you so much. One more
Yeah.
round of applause.
You're here.
Thank you.
And it's great to see so many folks here. Next month, let me look at my calendar to make sure I get the Sunday right. next month, it will be December 3rd. There will be a presentation that John Felix is chairing on 50 years of FSNE. John, do you want to talk about that briefly?
Well, I'm still putting it together. We'll be looking at, I'll be looking at the various what I call trains that FSNE has run over the last 50 years. Some of those trains include Photographica, the show, the journals, snapshots, and a few other things, and just the whole evolution of FSNE. It's not unlike the technology in cameras. Problems came up and they were solved with new technology in cameras. It's the same thing with FSNE. Problems came up with all of those trains and it adjusted, and it seemed to have worked. So let me talk about that a bit. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. We're looking forward to
The
it too.
presentation was fantastic. Thank you very much for doing it for us.
Jack, it means a lot to hear it from you. Thank you.
I'm really glad you two guys could connect. That's great. All right, everyone. I think that's it for this evening. There's a lot of comments saying what a wonderful presentation. And Chuck says I don't know how you pronounce it, Chuck. MIPHS program. So FSNE is
So
what is it?
that was it. MIPHS.
Okay. All right. And everyone, you can find this archived on YouTube in a couple of weeks if you would like to share it with other folks that way. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you in December.
Thank you for the opportunity as well.
Thank you. It's a great presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Thanks, Rob. All right. We'll see everyone next month. Have a great night. Dana, thank you so much. John.
You
and
bet.
Rob.
It's
night,
good
all.
to see everybody.
Night.
Right.
Good night.